Hi, and welcome to the panel on the future role of industrial edge computing at the free and virtual event Democratize the Edge, put on by Tulip. I am Trondheim Tulip's lead evangelist, and having worked with the founder since the inception of the company at the Media Lab at MIT, I'm here because I believe that industrial tech, and specifically Tulip's human-centric approach, will change the workforce and industry. But don't take my word for it. This panel is here to explore what others think about this and how it is going to pan out. Because the cloud is coming to you, said Tulip CTO and co-founder Roni Kubat just now. Now let's explore what that means, this new decentralized and perhaps democratized paradigm. Because it does open up a lot of opportunities. And I have a very distinguished panel here. Let's start with you, Ian. You call yourself the community curator, and you represent a prominent international organization, the World Economic Forum. You have a public policy background yourself and an MBA. Ian, real quick, how did you get into this business of community building for manufacturing, and why is it important?
Well, I think whenever you look at whenever you talk about manufacturing and the ecosystems that we have, people have to be at the center of that conversation. And so I think whenever we start these from the World Economic Forum's perspective of how do we drive change, how do we actually try to make sure that the entire sector, the entire industry, no matter what part of the world you're in, grows, we have to have the right stakeholders around the table. So from my perspective, it was really, if I wanted to try to be in a position where I think we can be impactful, I think and I believe that manufacturing and production ecosystems are the principal driver in that space. And I think that in order to do that, you need to be in a position where you can bring together private sector companies and all the people therein. But we need to be having conversations with the public sector stakeholders, with academia, with civil society. You mentioned you started having that conversation with the founder of Tulip at MIT. And I think those ecosystems where people are coming together is really where you start to see some amazing things. So I think that's what's always driving us from my perspective of trying to build a community around advanced manufacturing and value chains, is the need to make sure that we're making that process as inclusive as possible. And you already used that term, but I think it's really fitting in not only what technologies need to be, but also how do we actually strategize and build out the future of the industry and the sectors.
That's great, Ian, and we'll come back to those topics. Let's switch now to Rick Bellotta, who I call, or I guess you call yourself also, the artisan tinkerer. And you co-founded ThingWorks, you went to Cornell, and you are now spending a lot of your time, if not mentoring startup founders, you're spending your time exploring science still. Yep. And also, as we discovered here, repairing mountain bikes and sometimes mounting them as well. We can learn a lot more about you from Augmented, the podcast episode 10. But Rick, you have so many opinions about the industry, and I have to ask you, first off, were you that student in the back of the room that got the teacher into trouble all the time?
Perhaps. I may have been.
I sort of suspected that. But more importantly, why is it important to tinker and continuing to tinker with technology? Not just, I guess, as a CTO or something of a company, but it seems like you generally think tinkering is very, very important.
Generically, lifelong learning, right? I mean, it's, if you think about just in the span of my career, 30 years or so in this segment, the changes we've seen in the building blocks and technologies we have at our disposal to do things, the rapidity of change, and the rate at which change happens in our space. Arguably, the industrial sector's been a laggard in that regard. I personally tried to help, bring some new technologies, web technologies, things like that, distributed architectures into the space. But, ultimately, I think it's both making yourself the best you can be by being aware of technologies. And it also helps you find, the next big thing. A lot of what I'm doing now is mentoring and advising startups that are doing cool stuff in robotics and edge compute, AI, and so on. And it's actually indirectly through some of that kind of learning process that you find these really interesting and exciting companies.
But Rick, if you are not considering yourself technically literate, or at least you're on that journey, you're on the spectrum somewhere, but you don't feel like, I couldn't be the CTO of a company. What are the best ways for managers on the industrial shop floor these days to start tinkering? What's the best way to get your feet wet?
And I think the whole premise of a lot of our talk today is democratization, right? As we've taken things and, Roni talked about it a lot, the shift from centralized IT-driven computing, innovation, app development to the PC, and then back again and all points in between. We probably saw in the 90s through now a shift where less technical people can apply much higher level tools like the early HMI and SCADA packages, and now modern tools like Tulip, to be the innovator, to be the implementer, whether that's a manufacturing engineer, a supervisor who wants to self-serve an analytic environment of the things that are important to him or her in doing their job. It's a whole spectrum, but again, I think the tools and platforms that we have are increasingly going in that direction of more self-serve, self-create, empowering a different group of people to build things quickly and to innovate.
Yeah, we'll explore that, but I have to point out that you yourself just last week often get frustrated with the state of technology, even if it's your own technology. You were complaining on LinkedIn last week. You said, this ThingWorks evaluation version. So this is a product you yourself founded and created and sold to a company in 2013. And you were complaining that there's still dependencies on old Java code. There's lots of manual configuration. And this is not to out any company, but it's just to talk about this. Why is it so hard to maintain and further develop an existing industrial solution and application that's out there in the marketplace?
Yeah, maybe it's core skill sets, right? I mean, when you're architecting for a cloud first or a highly scalable, containerized, distributed solution, that's a different skill set. It's a different skill set than the bulk of the developers that exist in that kind of industrial software world. So there's some element of that, just kind of foundational knowledge. It's the classic innovator's dilemma, right? How often do you want to create the next big thing, which might obsolete something you've done before? And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of, you can make good arguments for both approaches, but I think ultimately we'll talk a lot about this today, delivering containerized, interoperable components to the edge, built much, much bigger, easier to deploy, easier to manage building blocks. There's technologies like containerization, like, other kinds of edge infrastructure that's going to make that more and more easier. And you have to put that customer and user experience first, the easy button, so to speak.
That's super interesting. We'll get to that, in 1 second. I just want to introduce NonWeng, our augmented technology designer, so to speak, who thought she would end up on Broadway. I believe this is something I read. We'll have to correct that if that's wrong, NonWeng. But you got yourself a PhD from the Media Lab, which is, as close to Broadway as I've ever been, I guess. It's a nice place to walk around and learn. And then you founded a company with biosensor technology that arguably will change workforce health forever, which is a fundamental issue, I think, in industrial tech and has been with automation for a long time. NonWeng, my legs hurt so much. I shared this with you that I've been walking backwards up and down stairs. I now can walk upstairs, but not down. It's not Tulip's fault, but, had I been running the marathon on Tulip's dime, how could you help me? How could your software both diagnose and suggest treatment plans for work-related injuries?
Yeah, thank you, John, for the introduction. I think in the industrial age, a lot of the productivity is optimized, but the people is the last piece of the puzzle. It's the health, safety, wellness of employees. And we have built a solution that really is aimed to create a data standard of care for musculoskeletal health. That is my back pain, your leg issue after running the marathon, because it's such a prevalent problem where 80% of population have a musculoskeletal issue, 20% becomes chronic. And in a workplace, especially in a factory manufacturing floor, 4 or 5% of employees in these categories will have lost days or claim workers' comp. What we create is like a standard of care, a test where we help people evaluate their musculoskeletal health, and either from a risk management perspective where you can highlight what are the potential injuries and you optimize and train and help people improve their performance. Or if you were injured or have some conditions, we help you monitor and guide the treatment or guide your recovery process. It's all data driven in a category of medicine that is normally just guesswork. Yeah.
No, I have to ask you this question. Why has it been guesswork up until now? We're 2021. Some of the technologies arguably, I mean, maybe not your technology, you worked hard on it, and you then found this use case, which is a blockbuster use case. And it took you a while, and I know you also from MIT, and it took you a while to figure out where the real, not just the money was, but where the real problem was in society that your technology could solve. Why didn't any of this get kind of automated before? Musculoskeletal care is a big problem.
It is a big problem, but if you look at the field of medicine, it is not like it's not a single biomarker. So it's not like I can just measure my blood pressure and that's it, or heart rate, and then you can just fix most of the cardiovascular problems. So musculoskeletal health has multiple biomarker, multiple segments. And the most complicated things when we talk about working with employers, that's the payer. There's always the provider and the patient. So I call it the three-headed dragon. In order to find different a marketplace where the adoption from all parties involved have the same incentive and in the same environment, it's actually a big task. So it took us a while to find this area of interest where everyone in the employer space would be incentivized to do better.
Thanks, NonWeng. We'll jump back to this immediately after I introduce the last panelist, who is Rob Rastovich, who I call the cattle farmer from Oregon, who went to Phoenix, then got deep into e-commerce and ended up building what now is called Amazon's AWS IoT solutions. You can also learn more about him from an upcoming Augmented podcast episode. That's going to be episode 44. Rob, what has cattle taught you about IoT?
That's a great question. One wouldn't think that those are necessarily the same, but actually the agricultural use cases for IoT are actually quite plentiful. And in fact, one of the couple things that we have been doing, we started building smart corral systems so that we can instead of I always say the cow that goes to market is the slowest one. It's the one that you can most easily catch. But what we're doing with these smart corral systems is with the RFID tags, as cows walk in and out, gates can automatically open and close so that we can move the cattle around. It's less stress on the cows and it's more safe for the handlers. So agriculture and even in row crops and those kinds of things are lots of IoT use cases, fertigation, efficiencies of plants, all that stuff.
Sounds good, Rob. This is wonderful. We'll get right back to that. Let me now ask my first main question, because we're going to hit on 2 or 3 super quick topics that are related to this. And number one here, I think, is we talk about a lot of the use cases, but I think there seems to be a lot of expectations out there right now that industrial tech at this moment, we are, arguably mid-pandemic. We have had so much progress in software and technology overall, and people are kind of asking for, when is industry going to move perhaps at the speed of software, and when are we going to see the kinds of innovations in industry that really are starting to affect all of us? And is that even realistic? If we were to try to build that thing, what systemic principles could get us there at scale? In such a hard environment, which both Rob, Rick, and NonWeng certainly represent, where they have been innovating, and it's not as easy as just sitting in a garage and figuring out a system, because you have actors, and you have legacy systems, and you have a material reality around you. Rick, can you just bring us up to speed on what you think is, maybe just pick the number one systemic principle that you think is needed for industry to live up to this potential of moving almost at the speed of software?
Sure. I want to add one item to that too, and I think it's capacity. I remember talking to a friend of mine who's a physician about all the new cool practice management technology, that they could implement, boost productivity, 15%. But when you're running at 110% capacity, you don't have the opportunity to step back and take the loss in productivity during that learning period, right? So in the manufacturing domain, we have a similar challenge. How can we implement these technologies in as non-intrusive a way? So I think we kind of find that pattern repeatedly. We're layering, new stuff on top of old stuff because it's the most expedient path to doing that. And then the second is going away from big bang implementations, right? If we remember like early MES implementations, they were almost like ERP implementations, multi-million dollars, months, years, a cast of thousands to make them happen. And kind of bite-sized deployments seem to be an increasingly popular way to kind of do things at scale. Prove it in an area, prove it in a site, and then rapidly deploy it if the platforms and tools that we use permit that.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. If the platform permits it, is it more than a choice of a business model? Because clearly, it's very attractive for a company to serve up a big solution and tell them, you're going to have to pay my implementers, and it's going to be a, $3 million implementation, and then you pay some fees on top of that.
Sure.
So changing that business model, I can understand is painful. But over and beyond that, what has to happen on the systemic level with the solutions? So the new solutions that are arguably low code, no code, or at least somewhere in between, what is it that they're doing differently?
Well, at a minimum, it's a different group of people. You're not at the IT choke point, right? It doesn't get on the long list of 470 other initiatives that need to be done this year. So you can harness a different group of people to break that logjam. Second thing is, as you do a rollout, ask any of Tulip's customers, people that in the industry that have rolled this stuff out. Sometimes it doesn't even pass the test of line number 2 in the same plant, much less plant number 2 or a different region. So the ability to rapidly reconfigure these solutions for the nuances and subtle differences across different sites within your own company becomes important. And again, the more that the folks closer to the processes and closer to the plant can do that, the faster you're going to be able to roll that out.
Rick, I must probe one level deeper here, because you and I go back to this podcast and we did explore deeply. I mean, you have been part of this from the inception when there really wasn't manufacturing technology. Why is that you guys didn't do this 20 years ago?
The kind of low code, no code approach, I would actually make the case that in certain domains we did. I mean, HMI and SCADA, the first iteration of that was, it's a much simpler and more bounded problem. Visualizing sensors, kind of replacing what used to be physical analog panels and gauges and meters. So a more bounded problem. When we start to get into these manufacturing execution systems, I think it was just the variability of what needs to be done across different industries, different verticals, different sites, different processes that made that challenging, right? So yeah, I think it's just a matter of evolution, right? We're now applying those same kinds of principles of rapid deployment, low code, no code, to a different class of problem.
Got it. Let me bring in NonWeng here. So NonWeng, you have created the first workforce relevant medical assessment product, arguably. I'm just curious, in this space, when you think about the architectural principles that you applied in terms of designing this for people, not just for the employee, you talked about these 3 groups that all need to be aligned, but one of them being the people who are being measured. How do you think about that aspect? Because in the early days of analytics, we had analytics, but the question was who could actually make use of those analytics? Can I, as an injured person now, actually get a benefit from your product? Where is my instant sort of motivation to engage with it?
So quantified self leads to behavioral change. Most of the musculoskeletal health solution is a cookie cutter solution because that's the simplest way to push out for adoption. For us, we will be able to showcase whether you're making improvement or not and make decisions, big decisions, arguably, like do you need surgery or not, whether the problem is actually musculoskeletal or is it stress related, or is it other things, neuromuscular? But I think the adoption really in the workplace is to align the interest of all parties involved, because the CFOs knows it's a big problem. When someone has a work-related back injury, they think about $50,000 per claim. For the site managers, they don't see it. For the workers, they're scared of losing their jobs, or they're not being able to go back to work. So align all the interests in who is running assessment, how do we display the data, and how do we create a contracting mechanism that's really, really easy to sign on, has been the biggest, really challenge or biggest improvement in how we integrate into this ecosystem.
But on the design side, NonWeng, you do have some advice on kind of the way that the technology should be designed these days to actually fit into industry without creating all of these problems that previous technologies have, like, becoming legacy systems that are like clunky and don't serve users. What were the principles you used to get there?
The principle, I think, first is really understanding the workflow and in which party that is in this ecosystem has the most bandwidth, or would even allow you to hire a person to run the job, so they only get the data. So in every state is a little bit different even. So it's a complex system, but who in this whole workflow has the bandwidth to take one extra piece of information?
Got it. I want to bring in Rob now, because you have several times brought to market IoT tools that are transforming industry and commerce, and because those who are using it no longer have to use code to get there. So it is this code issue. Why is low code and no code a game changer, and how can these design choices evolve even further? We can't hear you, Rob. I can certainly not hear you, so we have a little mic issue. There you are. Yep.
I think the low code no code issue is just kind of arriving in IoT. It's not it's not the first industry that's transformed like that. You look at Salesforce.com. They really kind of pioneered the idea of, okay, everybody needs a CRM. You need your sales pipeline. Your salespeople need to be able to track the opportunities and the contacts, and you don't want that Rolodex basically, going home with the salesperson if they leave. So that whole idea of going to the cloud and configuring your way to a CRM solution, I think has been pioneered by Salesforce, and creates a low barrier for business to get in. So businesses they don't have to invest in all the infrastructure and all the databases and all that other stuff. So I think creating businesses and creating products makes it a lot easier if you have a no code, low code solution. And ThingLogix really took a play out of that playbook and said, okay, well, everybody in IoT is going to need the same thing. I don't care if you're doing temperature sensors or you're doing cattle sensors, or smart homes or factories. You need context, you need workflow, you need all these building blocks that you should be able to put together. And there's no reason for every company and every solution to re-engineer and reinvent the wheel.
So I agree with you. The question always, though, in industry is, are we going to be able to sort this out ourselves? How quickly are we as an industry going to realize we have that need and then kind of jointly join up and create, standards bodies and decisions around interoperability? Or do we need some sort of help here from either government or other players to say, we're adding some incentive or maybe some punishments if you don't do this? How do you design industrial tech right now at this moment with the great interoperability so that these good things can happen? And do you think this is currently happening, Rob?
Well, I think I'm probably jaded in that because, and then that's the world I kind of live in. And we always say that, we invented a solution to a problem that people don't know they have yet. We've been doing this for 10, 15 years now. And it's just now coming to the point where I think people are starting to realize that, yes, we do need to have interoperability between our systems. But the other big change in all of this is really changing from a I always call it a request response architecture to an event driven architecture. IoT messages, all these new UIs, whether it's your voice UI or IoT devices talking to back, or even text messaging. That's an event-driven architecture, and all of our systems were designed around, request response. I send a request, I get a response. I send a request, I get a response. So we have to reinvent all the infrastructure that goes on there. AWS and Google and even Azure, are playing a leading role in that. So I do think today. That is there, but it's a mind shift. We have to start thinking event driven. We got to get out of the old request response type of stuff.
Got it. Let me bring in Rick briefly on the openness point. Do you think that proprietary solutions have started to go further enough, far enough along the openness, sort of path? Or are there still incentives? I know you're engaged in open source development, and there's nothing in open source that in and of itself makes it, more open. You have to actually work on openness in any community. But there certainly is a bent there towards desiring some level of openness. What is your view on that when it comes to industrial tech?
More pragmatist in the sense that interoperability is more important than open. I know that sounds strange, but everything is legacy the moment it gets put in. Standards, we just don't have a lot of them in this domain, or they're fragmented across different verticals. So the pragmatist says, hey, if there are APIs, can we build these unifying layers, right, that abstract away all the different stuff that we need to talk to. So as a buyer, I certainly wouldn't, as a customer, I wouldn't choose a solution that didn't have an API that allowed me to get at my data, to get at my processes, to do, to get at the functionality of that application. And then, you're still in most sites, they're not greenfield, right? So you're implementing, solutions that connect to a lot of old stuff. I made a lot of money over the years just unlocking stuff out of proprietary systems. It's a reality, right? But yeah, I think generically, most people are taking, I'm not saying an API first mindset right now, but it is becoming easier to start to build mashups and, composite applications that stitch things together.
So it's at the API layer that you should ideally start to standardize then?
Well, and I'd actually echo what Rob said too. It's kind of a definition of what you call an API, right? It's API plus, messaging patterns for more, real-timey, responsive, event-driven apps. There's APIs under there somewhere, but it's both an architectural pattern and a kind of a well-known way to get at the functionality and data from these systems. It's getting easier.
It's getting easier. Well, let me bring in Ian then and talk about this broader openness point and democratization, because the term democratization is sort of it's a fascinating one used for technology, and I wonder what it means to you. So you work in a public-private entity that works with a bunch of different organizations. So I can imagine that sort of stakeholder involvement is a term that's used in kind of NGO circles. But to take it then all the way to democratization, how does that term even get used, and what do you think it has to do with openness? So you've heard what others have said, and clearly, Roni and others from Tulip, we're all using this term. What does it mean to you who work actively with community building?
Yeah, I think I would actually tie it to the conversation you were just having, this idea of interoperability. And I think it doesn't start necessarily, I mean, Rick was just making this point about, you don't necessarily start with the APIs. And I think that that's a fantastic point, but it also starts with, as we design new systems, we have to be thinking about how they're going to or can connect into other systems. And I think, to me, that's at the heart of solving for that democratization challenge that you just mentioned. I would also, just going back to the points that were just being made, and I think Rob had mentioned the idea of, solving for a problem that people don't yet know they have. On the other side of that, I think that there's also this idea, that a sense from manufacturers that solution providers don't necessarily at the same time take the time to understand the problems that they do have. I think that there are the challenges that go with implementation of a new technology. The solution providers might come up with a fantastic new solution to solve a problem that does exist, but there's a lot of hurdles to actually moving that forward. And I think that when I think about democratization, it's also about taking the time to understand those hurdles that a company is going to have to go through to upskill and train its workforce, to actually transition to having, if we're talking about the creation of let's say it's additive manufacturing, we're creating new parts, the fact that these have to be certified parts in many instances, and the demonstration that they can be certified before an investment happens. So I think there's a lot of steps that go in, and if we really want to democratize and give everyone access to it, part of that balance comes on the service or the solution providers element of going through that mental thought process along with the manufacturers.
But how about the factories themselves, Ian? I know, at the World Economic Forum, the Lighthouse Factory project has, gotten just rightfully so a lot of attention because it actually shines the light on these top factories around the world that are truly efficient. What is it that they're learning right now in terms of sort of applying the true and tested quality movement of manufacturing in this digital age, which is so intensely digital when we're going to kind of squeeze out the benefits? What does sort of digital lean or agile mean in this day and age, if you just look at what the factories are learning?
Well, I think the factories are learning that they have to keep innovating. And I think that Rick brought that up at the very beginning, that if they're not continuously looking for sort of how they move forward, as soon as you implement, it's legacy. And that you'll see in the companies that are succeeding and that have actually survived and done the best over the last 2 years when the world's been dealing with major supply chain, value chain disruptions, that those companies that did invest in those types of solutions have managed to succeed. I think that it's also about how, and it fits very well into this concept and sort of the title of the conversation around edge computing, is they also know that implementing and having one amazing factory is great, but in the world that we live in, particularly when there are value chain disruptions, it's not enough. How do you have that level of sophistication that is distributed? How do you make sure that your systems are able to communicate? And you had asked a question before on sort of what's the role of sort of regulation and policy, and that sort of becomes tricky, because as you start to look at how data is captured and shared, and different regulations that are coming into play, it can create challenges for one factory communicating with another within the same ecosystem and within the same company. And so those are all things that I think require a lot of work, but that we're learning from this Lighthouse network is that how they're trying to manage that, how they're trying to be cutting edge and to adapt while still realizing they have to keep innovating.
Fantastic. I want to take us now into a time machine, and this is, thinking more a decade into the future, because even this decade we were sort of jumping into now, took us into quite some uncharted territory with the pandemic, and now with the supply chain crisis that's really facing everybody, even at the grocery store, something I actually thought would have happened a year ago, but is certainly now happening. Let's fast forward a decade in industrial tech, in industry. What are some of the things the panelists think will happen, and what are some of the things that you wish for happening? Let's start with you, Rob.
Oh, I would like. I think what will happen, and I can't wait for it to happen, is for us the disappearance of the browser, and the our tethering to computers to be connected. Again, it's more this request response type of architecture. You talked about grocery stores and how they're going to, what you're going to change in there. I can't wait to, you're starting to see these, curbside pickup and stuff because of the pandemic, but businesses are going to change. It's going to be very fundamental on, how you service your customers. You do not want to make them go to a browser and click something and order it. They're going to speak it into the ether and it's going to arrive. Industry and manufacturing are going to do the same thing, being able to get away from and move into UIs that are not even, nothing like we've seen, more holographic UIs, voice activated UIs. We see these today at a very small level in the Alexas and the Google Homes of the world. And I see that just expanding more and more and more. So hopefully we can kill the browser and email, by the way.
Got it. Well, I want to pick up on this because in industrial development, it's so easy to kind of, I guess, think of like, everything is what it is because, factories they must have been viewed as a big innovation, and certainly they were very disruptive when they arrived. They created all kinds of demographic changes. Just comment on that for 1 second, Rob, and then let's go to Rick. What do you think will happen to this concept of the factory? Is that also part, because you were talking about the consumer earlier, but surely, with supply chains and everything else, does it also decentralize the factory and the companies themselves?
Yeah, I think you're actually seeing this decentralization. We're seeing an exodus out of the urban centers. So we're getting a de-urbanization of our population. And they're moving out of the, 19th century industrial revolution. Everybody move into a central place. So that's happening socially anyway. And so I think manufacturing is going to happen on that way too. And the big thing, of course, which the piece that we all need to solve is distribution and movement of goods back and forth. We're seeing the bottleneck of that right now. Imagine that in a factory setting where maybe you have a decentralized system, but now you're having to move product and you're having to move stuff around to different physical locations. So I think that's going to be one of the keys.
Got it. Rick, can you comment a little bit on this when it comes to the fact that the current industrial age, as advanced as we think it is, it has created all of these choke points. How do we get around that? I mean, you've been designing these industrial systems. Did you guys not foresee these choke points? And certainly now that we're seeing them live and real, we've got to get rid of choke points.
Well, I kind of view it as a network of networks problem in a way. Like you think about, to Rob's point about, let me use a different term than decentralization, disintermediation. So if you think about a modern manufacturing or a modern product company, they may contract out the design. They may contract out the manufacturing. They may have an ecosystem of people that sell it, another ecosystem of people that service it. So now you've got this kind of mega matrix supply network, value network that's just totally different than what we're used to, right? Where it was all kind of one monolithic organization. So this whole ability to kind of compose processes and compose things across organizational boundaries is going to be important. That's going to take technology. Now, when you think about the network and network effects, where how a production entity or a distribution entity interacts with the energy network, how it interacts with all the other networks, with people, with consumers. I mean, you start to see some really interesting opportunities for step changes in efficiency, or even if it's not step changes, how valuable is a 5% reduction in water or energy or time or whatever? So composability of things across business boundaries is an area I'm excited about. I think the other one is just the, call it AI, ML, whatever, but these new technologies that will augment human capability as you get closer, to the edge, whether it's robotics, whether it's new modalities of user interaction. I kind of laugh because today, we've got AR-based stuff, but you show someone in a factory doing an AR thing and they're holding up a tablet or a phone. Well, they need their hands to do work, right? So we're not.
So is it the form factor, Rick, that we're waiting for? We're waiting for a better form factor.
Form factor, technology, and actually authoring tools, honestly, to create that immersive experience today. It's very, very time consuming to build that kind of visual representation, that digital twin of the environment. The more we can take it from the systems that were used to design that line, that machine, that building, whatever, I think that's going to shrink that quite a bit. I talked about that actually on a LinkedIn post the other day. But anyway, the point there is, I personally think it's going to be more a continuum than kind of big step changes in industrial. But
well,
yeah.
You've seen it over a point of time, so I respect that. But do you think the workforce is going to feel the brunt of those changes, or are they going to actually feel that empowerment? So the frontline worker here, the frontline industrial worker, how will they look upon this a decade from now?
I hope so, because that's one of the things. My first started my career in the steel industry. And I gained great appreciation for the value of the humans in the chain, the knowledge, the experience, and let's face it, even we think we're going to automate everything with robotics. The human hand remains something that we haven't even come close to reproducing yet, right? I guess my point is, I hope that's how it happens. There's another kind of school of thought that's like human, Lego blocks, easily replaceable, just in time. Maybe that's a reality, right? We've got to have certain instant skilling of people for different, for different roles. But again, I hope we take the approach of augmenting people and dealing with the productivity paradox that way, assisting them with technology. And maybe it's even more, I'd also like to see a shift in the things we measure, right? Right now, we beat on people for, these arbitrary things like OEE and other production metrics. Where is customer satisfaction, safety, and wellness, energy, and sustainability? So maybe as we rethink what's important to the company, we'll have different ways that we measure and how we how we treat our people and pay our people.
Perfect. NonWeng, I want to bring in you. What is your vision of the industrial and or workforce future? What do you see happening? What do you hope is going to happen?
Yeah, I think this whole concept of manufacturing optimization and the human-centric design has been focused on the production and the product and the user of the product, as opposed to people that manufacture the product. So I want to see the future when these companies, when they think about their bottom line, it's not just about the product and sales bottom line, but also in how to save costs, which like translate to wellness and productivity in human health and how we work with machines, right?
Yeah, isn't it staggering, NonWeng? I haven't even started doing that calculation, but I will. If you think about the last couple of decades investment in sort of like, I don't know, maybe an unfair characterization, but like fluffy software that we use for social communication, whatever it is. Some of it is translating now down to workforce, when it comes to Slack and other applications, but an enormous amount of resources society has spent on building things that haven't really trickled down into industry. So blue collar workers or anybody who just stands up working, who hasn't been sitting down, right? There isn't that much investment there. Do you think that the next decade will have more investment that's going to benefit industry's workers?
Absolutely. And it's really boiled down to decentralized healthcare. And digital health, like the telemedicine aspect, really, because of COVID, grew by 200%. You see the adoption; it really pushes forward by 5 years. I keep hearing that 5 years. Now, what Figure 8 is working on, we're working on the diagnostic part. We are working on not just getting these treatment suggestions over telemedicine, but how do you create tools and services that serve as an extension of a clinician's eyes and their hands, so that it can be distributed to everywhere in the world, as opposed to you see factories built next to a hospital, or a hospital will be built next to a huge distribution center, because the level of expertise and specialties is needed for these type of injuries or health conditions.
Isn't it a little bit sad that we needed an external event like a pandemic to organize ourselves for things that would seem fairly simple? Like if you ask people even 10 years ago, we all sort of knew that we needed to coordinate a little better. We needed to fix some supply chains. We did need to invest in industrial technologies, and we hadn't really handled workforce issues, right? Skills, training, health of workers. Those are really their issues. They were not hidden before.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and very few companies in the past focus on the industrial athletes. We call them industrial athletes. And I think it's just because whoever is on the factory floor is really far away from who's managing the balance sheet. And we will see workers' comp sometimes is even bigger than the whole payroll itself. So I'm really excited to see the change and really excited to be part of that wave.
All right, so I think we're now at the stage where we certainly can take in some questions. If they start rolling in, and please, people in the audience, seat us with some questions. I'm very curious to hear what's on your mind that goes for with the topic, right? So the future is about taking in advice and taking in opinions and questions from all around. It's not just about the panelists. It's about who, what questions are out there. We need to address them. As these questions hopefully are taking in, I want to take us back a little to this governance point and look at what are so we've looked at some of the systemic principles around kind of openness and democratization. We've looked a little bit at some guideposts, whether they be interoperability and standards or other things. We've also looked at some of the technologies. But then it seems like there's two things that we cannot really control that have contributed almost the most. It's startups that have developed products in the space and then either are sort of taken over or are actually starting to dominate in some segment, or it is an external event like a pandemic. So I'm curious, maybe we can start by just exploring this concept of the edge and what that truly means. Rick, why don't you kick us off? We've got some curious questions around what edge actually can contribute. And maybe you can clarify a little bit why edge is different from the cloud and what the true potential of the edge actually is going to be going forward.
Sure, and it's a definition thing too, right? We've got, if you really look at it, we've got network edges. It's not, I guess today it's everything outside the cloud is the edge, or the fog or whatever. But some of the things that Roni talked about were bringing cloud to the edge. And let's talk about that for a second, right? So you have two dynamics. You've got the kind of last inch edge, where some really exciting stuff is bringing, totally new capabilities to microcontrollers, AI, vision, ML, all that magic, right? And, communications and so on. But then we've got up the stack, some interesting work that the telecoms, along with the cloud vendors, are thinking about, or even private 5G networks for manufacturing facilities that will not only have communication, but compute. So now we can start to bring a lot of these, cloud workloads at the appropriate spot that we need for the things Roni talked about: security, availability, performance. So I think that's one important concept we should think about, is its edges and portable workloads. Where do you, whether it's containerization, Kubernetes, whatever, some magic that allows us to make workloads more location independent based on what we need.
So it's interesting that the telco industry, every time they have a new G, right, 3G was going to be the big thing. And then they were sort of saying 4G, even though they kind of knew that 4G wasn't making that much of a dent. But then 5G, obviously, is now kind of the big one. Is it truly a bandwidth question? Like, you can do more with more bandwidth, but you could do quite a bit already with 2G.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that's, there are use cases, sure, where, if you streaming AR, if everybody's doing that all simultaneously, yeah. But I think it's more some of the IoT-ish things that are intriguing, at edgy sort of things, like the ability to have massive more numbers of connected devices, not phones per se, right? But IoT-like devices, the very lower predictable latency, which we're used to in kind of edge control system networks. But so that's part of it. I think also the ability to move compute, storage, other capabilities up and down the network, so to speak, is kind of can tag along with that build out of 5G nodes are going to be much more dense, right? They kind of have to be because of the nature of the technology. But imagine now if co-located in those are racks and other compute and storage capabilities that we can leverage for smart traffic or smart factories or whatever that need that kind of highly available, low latency kind of stuff. Nothing to do with bandwidth per se, just an architectural pattern that enables that.
Got it. Let me bring in Ian a little bit, and then Rob. I wanted to talk about the broadband political kind of implications here, because in the U.S., for example, broadband for a long time hasn't really been a big topic, and you as a cattle farmer, surely must have a view on whether you truly need 5G out there with your cattle, and but it is an important point. If we want to push decentralized democratic edge technologies, to what extent is this something where somebody either has to argue whether their use case and start spreading these technologies, or they have to just be invested in by an actor that they can afford to do very, very long-term investment. And then so maybe Rob, you can comment on this, broadband to the last mile issue, and then Ian can pick that up on the World Economic Forum. And if these discussions, which were big in Europe, and certainly now with the pandemic we're discussing sensors in Africa and stuff. So maybe from a cattle farmer perspective, a cattle farm, and I use that just as a metaphor, and I'm not trying to pigeonhole you. There is already a lot of technology. Ag tech is a fast-moving area. Will ag tech take off, with or without 5G? And are you sitting there waiting for the telcos to help you out, or can you innovate on your own?
Well, so it's not so much bandwidth that's our issue. It's, I guess, band length. How far can we go? Like, we don't need a lot of data going through a small big pipe. We need a little bit data, but we need it a long way out, right? So agriculture, there's not cell towers in a lot of places where you want, and there's some really cool IoT stuff around. Cattle is my near and dear to my heart, but keeping track of cattle health. There's sensors that you can go, the ingestibles for cattle, drone technology and being able to, count them and monitor fences and pastures and those kinds of things. But like the LoRa technology is probably more exciting to me than like 5G, because LoRa has a long distance to it, but it's very small payload. It's not a huge amount of data that you can put there, but we don't need it. We just need to know that, hey, is the fence broken? Is the fence broken? Is the fence broken? No, it's not. And ThingLogix, we have actually in Africa, we have a customer out there that does small, low cost solar panels, and they get a refrigerator and a television and a couple plugs and monitoring those. And again, that becomes an issue of availability of bandwidth. We don't need a lot of bandwidth. Like, we're not going to be streaming anything over these IoT sensors, but we do need the range of it, which is kind of more important on our side for the ag side.
Ian, what are the discussions there on a global level when it comes to kind of bringing everybody up to a same level platform where you truly can get the benefits of IoT, wherever you are? Are these discussions happening? Large companies that have footprint all around the world, are they starting to argue that in order for them to truly get their products out everywhere, is the thinking more global there in sort of evening out and allowing those edge capabilities to emerge, or is that still a very early discussion that the likes of the European Commission are on it, but it's not really happening in other regions?
Well, I think the conversation that was just the last two comments were really important in that. I think first to your question, yes, 100% those questions around access are critical, particularly when we start thinking about, going back to your term around democratization, but probably the word that's more commonly used in this case would be inclusivity and access. So, I think there's, from an industrial perspective, a lot of the comments around we need to create a fair playing field. But not create so much regulation along the way that it actually inhibits the ability to grow and innovate and prevent the types of opportunities that we're discussing here. But I think going back to sort of where those conversations are, the comments that Rick and Rob both brought up, I think are the critical ones. Is that there are, 5G isn't necessary for everything we do. The same reason that blockchain isn't the right traceability technology for every value chain or supply chain situation. So it's, where do we need these technologies, and how do we evaluate those investment opportunities, and how do we make sure that there is some access to accomplish what is needed in there and allow for growth and innovation in those areas. And so I think you're seeing lots of innovative technologies to provide broadband or internet access to rural areas that are really exciting and that can be transformative. But it's also, this is a 20 years ago, there was conversations around municipal Wi-Fi and how that was going to help rural communities. But we're still in this situation. So I think it's going to be one of those situations where innovation is going to help, but it's also going to take some evaluation of the needs of the ecosystems where the access is required.
So maybe let's round off with a question from the audience about industrial applications, because we've been talking, I guess, about the factory, we've been talking about health and workforce applications, and we've been talking now extensively about kind of the use case of farming and distribution towards that industry. What about other more continuous manufacturing challenges in, oil and gas, chemicals, pharma, other industries where arguably industrial tech also took a while to get there, but is now starting to roll out? Maybe we can go to Rick Bellotta first on that one.
Sure. I mean, even if you take like oil and gas, chemical, food industry, I'll refer to Ronnie's presentation again about the beer, beer making, beer distribution, all that stuff. Think of an oil and gas company, right? You've got extraction, then you've got transportation, you've got refining, you've got distribution. The technology, so some fit the factory profile, some are more like a utility, some are more like a completely different animal altogether. So even within every one of those verticals, we can apply lots of different kinds of technology to solve their collective problems. And then you look at a pharma company, right? A pharma company is discrete manufacturing, it's a chemical manufacturer, and it's all points in between. So that I think the core elemental technologies that we're building on they're applicable across the board, right? Kind of those implant, edge kind of stuff, and then the distributed remote monitoring, kind of classic IoT stuff. But then you've got vendors with domain expertise that have built vertical solutions on top of that tend to get a little bit fragmented, but I don't think they're being ignored at all. I think they're just are different vendors in each of those different verticals and in each of the different parts of their value chain.
Yeah, well, I certainly think that Tulip's experience has been interesting in that regard, because if you think about the initial use cases, I guess it was just, there are so many things that weren't handled in those industries. So you could just sprinkle in between efficiencies with, a solution that was so easy to implement, and you can pick up some low-hanging fruit that didn't require, for example, regulatory approvals. But then also on the regulatory side, as we have gotten, much more lined up on that front, it turns out that that's an enormous apple to bite into, and there's so much improvement there because people have largely given up, right? This is an area of technology where I guess it is hard to innovate in regulated technology, but once you start cracking at it, there are enormous benefits to be had there. Ian, what do you think? Your charter started out, I guess, as sort of manufacturing. The name for the automation platform that you are part of at the forum is has manufacturing in it. But of course, manufacturing means manufacturing of so many different things. How do you even handle that when you have stakeholders as different as oil companies and pharma companies?
Well, I think it's a great question, but it's also exactly why our ecosystem at the World Economic Forum was created. We're the platform on advanced manufacturing and value chains. And that was because we needed a space to have those conversations that are not siloed into industry sectors. And that was out of the recognition that the drivers, if you're in, a traditional manufacturing sector, discrete sector, or if you're in pharma, if you're in oil and gas, there are disruptions and drivers that are cross-cutting in all of those. And I think you mentioned our global lighthouse network earlier, and that's a perfect example. We have oil and gas lighthouses. We have pharma lighthouses. We have the chemical lighthouses alongside the discrete manufacturers. So I think it's a testament also to the fact that these solutions and the drivers that are inspiring the solutions don't sit. You can sit within, you can have the same solution being implemented in textiles that's also driving transformation in oil and gas. And I think that's what's so exciting about this topic and this conversation.
Well, and this conversation actually could continue for a while, because these are challenges we're going to be having the next decade and beyond. Operational technology, right? It remains complex despite all of the advances that we've made. I want to thank the panel for exploring these with us. And the panel is available, I think, in the online discussions. You can reach out to them afterwards. And we certainly want to foster a continuing discussion. And, the ones that haven't been on the Augmented podcast, we will put them on there. So please check out augmentedpodcast.co, where we do have these discussions, and we have an in-depth discussion every week on Wednesday with an innovator, on augmentation technology, on industrial tech, on any kind of challenge that frontline workers, workforce, or industry and society overall might be facing. So I thank you for taking part in this exciting, I think, panel on the future of industrial edge computing. Thanks so much.